Hello and welcome back to the Anima Leadership Cafe. Each session, we explore insights and strategies that allow us to tap into our personal wisdom and collective strengths. So if you're looking to build healthier, more equitable, and interdependent relationships with yourself, your team, and your organization, you're in the right place. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you're the first to see when a new video is released.
I'm also an author. I've written 2 previous books that are more nonfiction but memoir in nature. And today's cafe is tied to the release of my 3rd book, which is specifically a leadership guide for racialized, other minoritized leaders in the workplace, but also for dominant identity or white identified leaders in Western nations who want to be able to identify the patterns and support minoritized people in the workplace. And that can be harder to do if we don't recognize the patterns when they're happening. So today's session, as I said, is tied in with the release of the book, which I have received. It's not, why is I'm going to actually just take my background off this blurring thing. I don't need to have that so you can see it properly. There you go. Which I'm thrilled about. It's a really beautiful book cover and really beautifully laid out inside, which you can't really see very well, but I'll just show you some of the pages in here. This is a table of contents for the book, and you'll see that it walks through 4 different areas, which each layer on top of the previous one. So the first section is really, and I've touched on the other areas in previous sessions. But just to locate us today, the first section is survive, being able to identify and name workplace patterns, because when we have language around things, we can frame, address, and work towards shifting them. The second section is impact, making your mark. And these are very practical strategies for how to have impact and influence within the workplace. The third section is called Heal, Reclaiming Wholeness, and the importance, especially if we're moving into a leadership role, of being able to work through our own internal wounds, unaddressed maybe traumas or dysregulations or what triggers may be there, so that we're more available to people that we are influencing and working alongside. The last section, which brings me to today, is called Thrive, Changing the Game. And today's session is drawn from the first chapter in this section, which is really looking at, for racialized and other minoritized leaders in the workplace, how do we use power well? I mean, power is a very loaded term anyway, and it is particularly loaded for those that occupy minoritized identities. So that's kind of where we're doing a little bit of a deeper dive. So to start us off, using power well. Part of framing this conversation is, conversations around leadership have really shifted, thank God, I would say, over the last, 10, 15 years, from being one that is very much part of that, I would say, neoliberal model, post-industrialization, up to the technological revolution, which was very much driven by, identity-wise, white, Judeo-Christian men, able-bodied, who occupied positions of power in all institutions across society. And that model of leadership was very top-down. It was very top-down, meaning quite literally, cognition is everything. People at the top know best. We're going to give you the answers. We're going to extract resources, information, and intelligence from those that work for us without giving any credit, kind of a colonial hangover. We are going to be very distanced from our own emotions. So it was based on a fragmentation of self, but also from others that have a different identity or differ from us in some way, whether they are lower in positionality or whether they are different in cultural background or identity. And over the last 10, 15 years, that conversation has been changing. It's been changing because of the influence of many factors, emotional intelligence research, other management research coming to the fore, which talk about leadership from a place of more wholeness, leadership through being in relationship, and leadership, servant leadership. It's framed in different ways, but basically leadership through being in greater connection. It's also because of the conversations around equity and diversity and why inclusion matters and how much we lose from people in the workplace when they don't feel included. It also has been influenced by critiques of extreme capitalism and neoliberalism and what that does to communities and cultures. So, all to say, when I think about heading into this next century, we're a quarter of the way into the 21st century. And part of when I was writing this book, I spent a lot of time thinking about, but because I have to tell you, this is writing a book for most people doesn't is not a good return on investment. For any of you that have written a book, you might be well aware of that. So why am I writing this? And one of the answers was because I deeply believe we need a huge shift towards a different order in our society where there is more inclusion, where we do have systems that are set up to support the interconnectedness of all different life forms, which are not based in domination, but are based in relationship. And who better to lead that thinking and that systems change than racialized and minoritized leaders who have been the most wounded by the misuses of power? Like, no one knows better than many of us on this call. And, we all, in some way, shape, or form, even if we are white identified, have probably experienced exclusion in other forms, um, have spent more time thinking about and being able to articulate and feel in our bodies what the misuse of power feels like. And there's an opportunity in that, is what I want to say. There's an opportunity in that to be able to, once we gain more influence in our place of work in our communities, to shift the rules of the game, to shift how things operate, to be a model to others, and to frame up to others how we can use power differently. It starts with recognizing the power we have as well as the power we don't have. So I spent many, many years, first of all, not recognizing power at all, which is, I think, true of many of us. And then when I got involved in activism and progressive culture, I became very aware of the power I didn't have. When I started out in my 20s, because of my age, because of my gender, because of my racial background. And that was my frame occupying leadership roles for many, many years, was from a position of fight and challenge and critique because, you know, I was so hyper aware of the ways in which I didn't have power in many rooms I walked into. It took me longer to be able to recognize, and I would say this is very connected for many of us to the healing journey, to recognize the power and the influence I did have access to, which was sometimes positional power. Sometimes I had expertise, like power of, having a certain educational background and being able to talk about things in a particular way. I had access to power because of certain aspects of my identity, because I'm able to be articulate and to be extroverted. Um, so, for all of us, if we want to have impact, it really means having a realistic or fulsome snapshot of where we have less power in our workplaces and institutions, and also where we do. I'm going to paint a tale of two leaders because being aware of our power, um, and then there's how we use it within the workplace. So Judy and these are, by the way, unless I got permission from people, all names in the book are pseudonyms, as is this name Judy. So, just to make that very, very clear, it's not a person that you don't have to worry about identifying this particular person. So Judy was um, uh, racialized woman in a workplace and had some positional influence. She oversaw a couple of teams. Um, Judy knew many people within the institution, but despite that, very easily was hurt and upset by the missteps of others, whether they were intentional or not. Judy was somebody that, and I had a couple of conversations with them and encouraged them to figure out how they could strategically give feedback. Um, but Judy was somebody that chose to rarely, if ever, give feedback to the offending person, whether that person was above them or a colleague or somebody that worked for them, was very hesitant to have those challenging or brave conversations. And as a result, partly because of this, the stress really had built up over the course of many years. And they were somebody that really struggled with a couple of different autoimmune issues. So there was kind of physical um, pain going on. Judy didn't know how to say no very well and would often feel that they had to kind of say yes and do things, and then would often feel resentful afterwards. Um, would often present Judy was somebody who would often present an accommodating face to others, but would be distrusting of people's intentions and would often gossip about them behind their backs. And there was this sense that nothing was good enough. Even if somebody had done something a little bit differently or was trying a bit of a different direction, it was always met with, well, that, you know, the most seeing the most negative intent behind their action or painting out what should have happened more. And generally felt like a victim of her circumstances. Now, most of us know variations of somebody like Judy in the workplace. Um, Somebody who tends to feel disempowered. And there's a way where often, for many of us, and I shared my own experience earlier, when we're starting to become aware of our racial identity or other aspects of our identity that we, act as a detriment um, against us in most situations where we're underestimated, dismissed, ignored, um, uh, infantilized, um, that we can use that awareness to feel continuously disempowered. And that is where a lot of people, not everyone, but that can get stuck for many years. And because I've worked with I do equity and inclusion work. So I've worked with racialized leaders. Often people will come to me at breaks, lunch after the session to share their stories. This is a trap for a number of racialized leaders within institutions. And I think it can turn into a way of people can fall into a place of actual, over enough years, despair and quiet quitting. And, I'm here, but you don't get any real part of me. The other tale is of Amira. And was racialized woman in a different institution and was at a similar level of management to Judy. And Mira had this impact when they would walk into a room where it was really subtle, but people would kind of shift their bodies towards her. They brought a little bit of calm and regulation. Amira as well faced considerable challenge with a senior white leadership team, but was able to put it into context and didn't take it personally. Was really good about taking the time to strategize and figure out how to go back and move things forward. And Mira, what struck me about them, that they would wait for the linchpin moments to create change rather than feeling like they had to take on every single conversation and battle, which is a real trap for a lot of us, or can be. Used humor a lot and was often laughing with others and found a way to make meaning of her circumstances. And part of that way of making meaning was they had a really realistic timeline of change and what change was possible. You know, the more people we have within a workplace context, generally speaking, the longer it takes to shift one little things because it just, the Titanic took longer to turn than a little rowboat would. It's just a reality of the more people, the more, generally speaking, time it takes to create even one shift. And Amira occupied a position of high trust within the organization with most people. And it struck me how discerning she was of who she could trust and who she wasn't. So it wasn't like the polar opposite to Judy of, I trust everyone, or I'm kind of, my door is open to everyone. She was respectful towards everyone, but discerning of who really had her back and who didn't. There is always a choice, and everything we say and do within our professional role of whether we act from a place of feeling empowered or whether we act from a place of feeling disempowered. Loretta Ross, who some of you might know, is a leader in the US, the reproductive rights movement. She's a MacArthur Fellow, and her book just came out last year, said, I've learned to check my first response to things because that's usually my trauma speaking. It's the second response that I've learned to trust. And really I thought that was so powerful. And I can really identify that often with myself, where when I'm triggered, my first impulse often can look a little bit more like Judy, where I want to sort of, but if I can take the time and I can digest my emotions and figure out why am I having a reaction to this, what might be the smartest way to really step in, when I'm able to respond from a more empowered posture, the impact is night and day. So we all have that choice. And especially that choice becomes even more important when we hit difficult situations. The more challenging a situation is, the more trust capital we lose with others when we react this way versus this way. There was one of the participants in the BIPOC Leader Lab said, and I thought this was so well put, I have to really understand my own position and the power dynamics within my position to be successful. I think oftentimes people just don't do that. So how do we use power well? I'm going to offer three suggestions. The first one is if we are really invested in creating a different model of leadership that is going to create more interconnected and inclusive systems, I don't think there's any way around this tip, which is we need to be able to access a model vulnerability. Brene Brown talks about this at length. People that study teams have found, Patrick Lencioni, as well as others, have found that the number one reason why teams operate well is because there's a basic level of people feel enough trust to expose a basic level of vulnerability. Now, does this mean we go to our deepest, darkest emotions? Absolutely not. But it does mean being able to share enough of how we are feeling that we make it okay for others to also bring their humanity to the table. Now, I know that there's an ongoing conversation about, of course, the risk for minoritized people in the workplace to be vulnerable is higher than for dominant identity folks. So, one of the things that I say is we need to be strategically vulnerable. It's also a trope or a setup to go to the other end of the continuum to what Brene Brown or other white identified management people are saying, which is, expose vulnerability and with your team all the time. it's a setup to go to the other end of the extreme and put ourselves in a lockbox where we also buy into the belief that I can never expose any vulnerability ever as a racialized leader. That's also imprisoning, which I've heard a number of racialized people say. And I think, well, you've just locked yourself. Doris Lessing had a book called The Prisons We Choose to Live Inside. What a great title. That's a prison we're choosing to live inside. It's not one or the other. We can choose when and how we offer vulnerability to serve a purpose for our team. And when we're able to do that, we show that it is possible because our generation of leaders, for many of you on this call who are racialized or marginalized for another aspect of your identity, or sometimes it's more than one, we are the first generation, really, many of us, occupying leadership roles. I mean, think about that in this part of the world. I mean, it's sometimes I think when I think, oh, that was really hard or that session was hard, I remind myself of that. I have few peers that I can, those of you on this call or many of peers that other folks in institutions that are trailblazing. And each time I choose to model vulnerability, I am implicitly giving permission to people around me that it is okay to also, you can hold on to your wholeness in this institution. You can be who you are and you can still have influence. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Which it did have to be, I think, just being realistically speaking, for people in the last previous generations, it did. It was, whereas those of us now, we have a little bit more choice. Um, and I'll give an example. When our organization was rapidly growing during COVID, we had a huge number of big new hires. And I remember our operations manager coming to me and saying, early into the process, there's a couple people that feel like you're micromanaging when you're giving instructions, and I think you need to step back. And at first, it really pissed me off, and I thought, well, you can imagine what I thought. I'm not micromanaging. I'm just giving information and making sure it happens in the right way. But after I thought about it, I realized that I did my second reaction, moved into a mirror mode and thought, okay, there is some truth to this. And at one of our next staff meetings, at the end of the meeting, I asked to speak, and I acknowledged that this too was a growing process for me, and that I was, and part of the learning curve was sometimes I might overstep and micromanage, and it wasn't my intent. And I was going to do a better job in noticing when I did that, and also really welcome feedback if you're feeling that from me. So it was a risk of vulnerability in a way that was appropriate, and I think created more trust with myself as leader of the organization, and gave permission for others to also be upfront in a way that would serve the team and relationships on the team. The second tip is ask for feedback. One of the biggest things that happens for folks, even if it's just a slight promotion to a different level of positional power or influence, is that people feel less comfortable giving us feedback. So even if we've, been a team member and then we get promoted to a team lead role, we might assume that, oh, well, people are just going to come and talk to me the way they did 2 months ago. It is not true. Even a little bit of positional power will make it uncomfortable, or identity power will make it uncomfortable for people to come and give feedback. So one of the biggest ways we can use power well is making sure that we create opportunities for both formal and informal feedback from those we work with. If we're not in a formalized leadership role, then we can still do that with people that we work alongside. It helps us manage the gap between intent and impact for all of us. There's that gap between what I meant when I was saying that versus how it was received. And any responsible leader needs to be able to close that gap as much as possible. Can you see my face when I'm speaking? Okay. I just wanted to, okay. We're also, just because we've been on the receiving end of misuses of power, doesn't mean that when we get into leadership roles or team lead roles or project lead roles, that we're going to use that little bit of influence or more influence that we have any differently. And so we have to know when we go into leadership, like I'm also going to make mistakes about how I use my power and influence. I might be a racialized leader that does not support somebody's learning disability or physical disability because that's an area that I have no awareness of. And setting up regular feedback processes is a way where I can expand my own inclusion practices too. Of course, when we receive feedback, it doesn't mean that we have to take every last thing as absolute truth. We choose what we take in and what we discard. I'll also say that it is really instrumental to professional growth. One of the studies that I quote here is was done by Ritu Basine of Basine Consulting in tandem with the Catalyst Center, and they found that for racialized folks in the workplace as well as female leaders, um, they receive 50% less feedback than do their white male counterparts. Which I thought was fascinating. And when feedback is given, it's usually around how to be less sensitive and more nice. So less about technical skills and more about appearance. Uh, so it's also helpful for us to receive feedback because it just makes us better. Um, a few years ago, I was brought in to do a 360 assessment of a couple leaders of a very what's the word, influential small NGO, and one was the ED, and I did their assessment and gave them the feedback, and they were very open and they incorporated a couple things, and it made a difference within the team. The other was the chair of the board, and it was ironic because one of the pieces of feedback um, was in the area of listening and accountability. And when I tried speaking to them about next steps, um, they didn't want to discuss anything further, even with me. So their listening and accountability even showed up in the assessment, um, to their detriment because trust was already low with this leader because I'd heard from all the staff, and it just meant that that was going to continue to be an impediment for their influence in the organization. The last one is creating accountability. Accountability is a really big pillar for psychological safety. Yes, some workplace contexts can have a very rigid accountability structure, and so you have to know your workplace. And in which case maybe it could be loosened a little bit. But I will say just generally the idea of um, here's the work map, here's the differentiated roles, here are the deadlines, here's what we're talking about in this meeting. Clarity creates inclusion. When there is fogginess or confusion, it usually lands more on the shoulders of marginalized or racialized people, and it sucks. So it helps create more psychological safety. It sets each person up for success, not just the usual folks, um, those with dominant identities who tend to have the wind at their backs for in the workplace. And it also lessens the load on our own shoulders, which is a big thing for many racialized leaders. Um, there was I'll just finish this and then Masika, can I ask you to hold your question just for um, 5 minutes, and then we'll have some time for conversation. Um, there was a team I was working with in a big, large institution across Canada. This person was a pretty senior manager. I was doing some coaching with them, and I asked them, um, the institution definitely had its own strategic plan. Some departments had their own plan tying in with that, others didn't. Theirs did, but the meetings, team meetings, didn't tie in with that plan at all. To the extent that when I asked them, well, do you have a team agenda? Well, no, not really. Well, what do you talk about? Well, the the director of our department just comes in and kind of talks, and we just talk about what they want to talk about. And I thought that was really telling. And setups like that, like I've said, really tend to create stress. Um, for racialized and other marginalized leaders because a lack of certainty can often trigger the survival instinct, and pushing people into working harder. And I know it did for me many, many years ago when I was in a workplace and I had a very erratic white woman in a leadership position. And despite trying to get clarity, this person was all over the place. And during the course of that year, I lost a quarter of my head of hair due to stress. So, clarity, accountability is really important. The last thing I'm going to say here is that learning to thrive is a practice. Um, it's a practice, and we can get there. I really do believe that, even though still there's a lack of racialized and minoritized leaders in many institutions. Like we've been talking about, we are among the first that will be moving into more senior roles. And personally, I don't know about you folks, I don't want to have more power or influence at the expense of my personal joy and health and ability to thrive. That trade-off is not worth it, and it's not good enough. It is not good enough. We deserve more. So I it's a practice. I think about aluminum, which is a really light metal, but very strong at the same time. Um, no doubt, uh, the second point here, thriving is more challenging for many of us because of our identities, because of being among the first or the few or the only, as in Deepa Purushottam's title of her wonderful book. But it can also be more rewarding because of that, because we're forced to do more inner work. We're forced to, we have more opportunity to change the systems because of, as I said earlier, because of that awareness and because of having to struggle a little bit harder. And I think about what Loretta Ross said, where she said, I think about myself as a link, another link in the chain of humanity, starting from millennia ago and stretching on beyond me. And how do I make choices in my lifetime focusing on strengthening my link in the chain? And I think that's such a powerful way of thinking about it. My choices, what I say and do every day, whether I choose empowerment or disempowerment, either break oppression because I'm choosing empowerment and strengthen my link, or if I'm choosing disempowerment, which we all make mistakes, is okay, um, uh, can reinforce. Or we can create another wave of oppression different than maybe race that plays out in the next generations to come. So how we use power in our identity, in our generation, in our workplace, in our geographical zone, it matters. And we can repair or we can reinforce. And the last words go to Mindy Kaling. I'm a big fan, uh, who wrote in her memoir, Why Not Me? If you've got it, flaunt it. And if you don't got it, flaunt it. Because what are we even doing here if we're not flaunting it? And I sometimes think, go girl. So I leave you with those words. And I'm going to move to, we have a few minutes now for thoughts, reflections, questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I just had one question when you were mentioning here, clarity creates inclusion. It sets up people for success. Fogginess results. tends to result in negative outcomes for marginalized folks. Agree with the thought. I just want some clarity around how. Could you provide an example or maybe a story?
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, great question. Um, because if there's not clarity around a deadline or whose role it is or what the expectations are, um,
Oh,
one of the biggest patterns that play out for racialized people, as I said earlier, is that tendency to be underestimated or ignored or um, infantilized or not seen as competent. So the lack of clarity, if something doesn't go right, there's more tendency for the blame or the, even if it's
oh yeah.
subtle, for the finger pointing to go towards racialized or marginalized folks on the team or in the workplace.
That's correct. I see what you mean now. Marginalized folks, especially Black identifying folks, are degraded, devalued, dehumanized before the thought comes out of their mouth. So when something negative happens, it's easier to jump on and say, "Hey, this is," and get that more critical judgment, less benefit of the doubt, all of that. Yes, I
Yeah.
understand it now.
Valerie, you've had your hand up for a long time, please.
First of all, thank you so much for the book and for the work that you're doing. I can think of many organizations here in the United States that can really benefit, and that's a separate conversation I'd love to have with you. And I have started promoting the book to BIPOC listservs that I'm connected with. One question I have is on the strategic vulnerability. It almost feels like we're talking there. They feel like what is the word oxymoron?
Mm,
That they're kind of different energies. And I understand the point is really well taken that you're using these two words to refer to how we choose to be in choice about being vulnerable, and that makes sense. And layered in these two terms is the emotional labor of all of that.
Mhm.
Um, so I want to lift that up. And to me, there's a part of just the word vulnerability that really is pointing to authenticity, which may be a little bit different than being strategic, in the use of one's own emotions. So it feels like it's a kind of complexity to me about being authentic and genuine, as opposed to trying to being positional and strategic. So
yeah,
I'd love
yes,
to hear your
absolutely.
thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's a good clarifier, Valerie. Never, I don't think performing or trying to put in emotions that aren't true is ever a good move, and certainly does nothing toward that model of inclusive leadership that I talked about earlier. The example I gave of disclosing to my team that I was also on a learning curve was very genuine. Um, and when I say strategic, I thought ahead of time how deeply I wanted to go. That was a strategic part. I'm not going to come here and sort of pull the full curtain aside and talk about, all the different, because that would not have been appropriate. So I did, so that's what I mean. The emotions were real. And I thought about what do I want to frame? How far do I go to let them see enough that there's rapport and trust. And I'm also looking after myself in that process and not overexposing myself because I think what you're pointing to, Valerie, is overexposure is a big risk for a lot of racialized folks in the workplace. And so we also want to be protective of our own expertise and authority.
Yeah, I mean, by nature of our identity, there is vulnerability. Um, and I think that that's part of who and what we bring, and it's a beautiful part of who and what we bring. And I appreciate the person putting in the chat the book on authentic leadership. And what I have found is that even when I'm the only racialized person in the room, yeah, that being authentic and real and vulnerable touches our humanity, and the not trying to control how somebody is going to receive that feels in me aligned.
Mhm. Yeah.
And what other people do with that, that's on them. And I do hear that I do hear that we need to be wise and not
Yeah.
overshare, and that makes sense to me. And for me, as a racialized person, I've spent my whole life like, pulling up a wall
Mm.
to people who do not, either I feel like
Yeah.
perceived do not deserve or are not
Yeah.
prepared to receive me.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a whole long-winded thing, but
Yeah.
I so respect your writing. Congratulations. I respect the work, and I'm just so delighted that we're even having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, and huge props to you. Valerie, please put your book or links to your books in the chat here too, because Valerie is a very um, has written some very powerful books about these similar themes that I really want to lift up too. So please put them in here, Valerie. And yes, I think that's a discernment piece. There are people and groups that I would not expose vulnerability in. Um, and I think that that's a leadership choice and an important one too. Rebecca, please.
Hi, I very quickly wanted to flag that Rabia has a question. And just before we get to it, I also wanted to add to the group, and I think I've mentioned this a few times. So folks have come to our conferences, you might have heard me, but what I always find really interesting, I think, is for younger folks of color coming up into these positions, it is so important and interesting to see the kind of leadership that we're mentored by. And I always say, like, Annahid and I will be doing like a session together, and we'll take a break. And Annahid will say for a second, how did that feel? What do you think? And it's this funny thing of like being vulnerable and also still holding the space, where I've learned through that modeling at as a younger person to be able to step into that already. And to me, that is such a great um, opportunity. So I think that it is amazing for folks to be in this room talking about their own leadership, and thinking about how to really expand in and use our power well, because I think there's a whole group of folks looking up to you. And it's just exciting for me. I always say this, like, I just feel so grateful to be in spaces like this where I'm watching authentic leadership, where I'm watching vulnerability, where I'm watching mistake making and apology and repair, and holding space and being boundaried. I think for me, it's going to change the trajectory of how I do my life's work. So, just to say that I'm very excited, and for all the folks in this room too, that there are loads of people that are very grateful for the trails that you're blazing.
Beautifully put, Rebecca. I think that was a prop to folks here for what you're doing. And yes, it matters. Rabia had asked a question. Um, um, Rabia, I mean, there's not one answer, but I would say uh, to think about how you frame that allyship and your ability to truth speak in a way that really is serving the mission and the purpose of your organization and why that role is important. And perhaps also to think about when you're in the leadership role, that you will be thoughtful about where, how, and when you share your opinions within the team. So I think that there's some pre-work to just think about how you not to minimize or disavow that part of yourself because it's a strength, but just think about how you frame it in the context of the role you'll be in and the organization at large. Does that help? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for the work you're doing. I don't think there's any more important time in my lifetime than now for really being able to challenge and create discomfort in really challenging the status quo, because it really needs challenging. And so whatever ways that we make our choices to stay empowered and to create better inclusive systems is important, and it's not easy. So I see you, and I thank you all for being here. So bye, everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Anna.
Take good care. Thanks so much.